Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. All right, so today I'm really excited because I have another great guest for you. Her name is Dr. Anna Gibson, and she's doing some really interesting work using evidence and theory-informed principles of human behavior to design interventions that drive individual, team, and organizational effectiveness. And you guys know, on this show, we love evidence-based applications of principles of human behavior. Dr. Gibson specializes in partnering with leaders and organizations to become happier and healthy places to work. As a licensed psychologist and organization development consultant, Anna is passionate about creating high-impact solutions to organizational problems, promoting organizational conditions that support employee well-being and DEI, and building ongoing client partnerships. She provided services across many sectors and industries, state and federal government, tech, healthcare, entertainment, and many, many more. Anna is also one of my friends and former colleagues from the Department of Veterans Affairs National Center for Organizational Development. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ernest. It's good to see you.
It's really great to see you, Anna, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. You know, I love what you're doing, and I really want to dive into that. But as always, I also want to talk about your story because you have such an interesting story. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up as a psychologist doing consulting work.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was very young, when I was about 8, I got very involved in theater. And that was, I was one of those people that thought I was going to be doing that forever and then realized at some point along the way that I was probably going to need a day job. So at that time, I joined an audiobook recording studio, which was a really cool first experience out in the workforce. It was, a small place, and it was managed by folks who really weren't engaged very much in the employee day-to-day experience. And as I was working at that studio, what I was realizing was when the leaders were in the building, they were having a significant impact on the morale of the people who worked in the office. And if they weren't there, it really felt like an entirely different culture to be a part of. So just as I was going through my day-to-day work, I started to get more and more interested in, what organizational factors influence how people enjoy being in their jobs. And I'd gotten a degree in college in psychobiology, so I already kind of had that interest. But it was really that day job that was kind of a springboard into leadership development and organizational work. And as I was deciding kind of how to move my career forward, what I landed on was a clinical degree because I got great mentorship at the time. And what I was hearing was, go get the skills that will allow you to work really effectively with any person, any person who you come in contact with. So my grad training was really focused on, individual adult clinical therapy, which I was then sort of leveraging into leadership development ultimately. That was my plan. So I was sort of grab bagging a bunch of different experiences at the time, but ultimately got my degree in clinical work and then transitioned, as you know, into full-time organization development work from there because it was just, I knew I was interested in this focus primarily, but I took a sort of circuitous and strange route to get there.
Yeah, I love that story. I love audiobooks, and so it's kind of interesting to hear that there's a whole business behind that, right? And there's a whole culture behind that. And so I think it's really interesting to hear how you went from that, realizing the experience that you were having as an employee was highly impacted by the leadership of the organization, and then thinking to yourself, how can I have an impact on this? How can I play a part in this? So I think that's so cool. I love what you do now in terms of using evidence-based principles of human behavior. Tell us, why is that important to you to use that evidence-based?
Yeah, well, my clinical training was very focused on theory informed work. So very first year, we spent quite a lot of time learning about different theoretical orientations just when it comes to clinical work. So, everything ranging from psychoanalysis to newer forms of psychodynamic therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy to acceptance and commitment therapy kind of ran the gamut of, how do you think about a person's psychology
Hmm.
and the factors that inform how they show up in the world. There's quite a bit of variance in evidence when it comes to the efficacy of various types of theoretical
Yeah.
models. And so there has really been, I've been very interested in evidence-based, treatments for a long time. But then also, there's not, when we look at, double-blind research studies, we don't necessarily see the same kinds of efficacy in the longer term therapies as we do in the shorter term
Mm.
therapies. But what we know is that that's not because they're not effective or, that their efficacy isn't really strong. It's that it's a harder theoretical model to study at the end of the
Hmm.
day. That kind of longer term treatment is just hard to look at. And what we're seeing over time is that there really is good evidence to inform those treatment models. All of that to say that psychodynamic work tends to be more of my
Yeah.
approach. And what's become really important to me over time is incorporating other evidence-based practices that are really, what's the word that I'm looking for, kind of collaborative or
Hmm.
complementary to psychodynamic work. That ultimately I believe that, the first environments that we exist in our early life and our lived experiences as we move through the world really inform how we show up in our day-to-day work.
Hmm.
So we can use evidence informed practices to apply to our day-to-day lives, but it's also really important to get to that underlying, core
Yeah.
stuff that's influencing how you're showing
Yeah.
up. So that's really what drove my interest in it, and now I use evidence informed practices in the workspace
Yeah.
kind of as a result.
I really love what you're saying there because for a number of reasons. I think one of them is that because I'm a data driven person and I believe strongly that there is so much richness in the research that's done in behavioral sciences. That I think there's so much evidence there and there's so much data there that can be used as information to help uh, people as they're trying to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of their work environments and their experiences. So I really appreciate that you are using that and then integrating different approaches because again there are so many different approaches that you're likely to find one that speaks to you and works, right? And so I love that you're integrating that into the work that you're doing. Tell us about the work that you do now. What kind of work do you do and how do you apply this?
Yeah, I do quite a variety of work right now. I consider myself, in the field, I consider myself still somewhat of a
Hmm.
generalist and still sort of finding my way and really what I feel the most excited about to really keep digging into and become a specialist in. So I do a broad range I offer a broad range of
Hmm.
services right now. Everything including like executive coaching, working with one on one leaders, and helping them, identify how they want to be leading, kind of finding their own leadership voice, but then also addressing kind of core areas of need. I'm working with a few folks right now, for example, who have ADHD and are just struggling to manage their time.
Hmm.
So I'm not treating ADHD as I would be in a clinical setting, but I'm helping them figure out, how do you navigate the symptoms that you experience in a way that can make you more effective in the workplace. And then, so executive coaching, I do a lot of leadership development. I work with teams fairly frequently, helping teams work more effectively with one
Hmm.
another. So that includes things like conflict mediation as well, helping people work through, when you run into something sticky with an
Yeah.
employee or with, a colleague and you just can't quite work through whatever that challenge is. Sometimes I'll come in to support folks with that. And then the work that I get really excited about is broader organizational systems and culture
Hmm.
work. So,
Hmm.
in and looking at what is going on in this organization, like if you've got if you've got a high attrition rate, for example,
Yeah.
in your organization, or you're having difficulty with employee retention, or burnout is really high, what I really get excited about is looking at kind of what is driving that. what is driving those factors, and then what interventions might be able to help support moving that system
Hmm.
in a different direction. How do you kind of address that? And so that broader systems work really, yeah,
Yeah.
is kind of the meat of what I do.
So, Anna, I know you do some work with startups, right? And so I'm really interested in the culture of startups because that can be a very high paced, high impact, very stressful culture. What examples do you have of the work that you've seen or the culture that you've seen in those environments, and how do you address those to help them get past some of those that stress and anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So the majority of my experience with startups is in the digital health
Hmm.
field and a little bit within digital therapeutics, a little bit within digital medicine, but primarily, well-being
Yeah.
tools, wellness tools, and digital therapeutics sort of incorporated in helping people kind of identify whether they need clinical support or whether they just kind of need some tools to help them navigate their worlds more effectively. So, that being said, my startup experience has really, what I have seen in startups is that fast paced
Hmm.
growth. And organizationally, what often happens, and we can talk about this from a clinical
Hmm.
perspective, is that the people who start a startup may not necessarily have the skill sets to help bring an organization into their next
Yeah.
phases of growth or development. So there's this really interesting tipping point where, in an organizational life cycle, a startup will need to transition into sort of different organizational approaches
Hmm.
to be able to maintain or even find profitability in the first
Yeah.
place. So I get really excited about what happens in that early phase that can influence whether a startup can be sustainable in the long run or not, and are those people who you initially hire in, do they have the skill sets to really lead an organization into their next
Hmm.
phases?
Do you have any examples of a startup that you've worked with and how you've helped them figure that out, that transition?
Yeah, sure. So I worked with Modern Health, which is an employee point, basically an employee assistance program, but they consider themselves an employee point solution.
Hmm.
Uh, so they offer coaching services, they offer therapy services, and it's primarily driven by it's their services are offered within an app, so it helps folks get connected to their interest level and their area of need, services that'll help them kind of address that. So when I arrived, I was brought in to help design strategy around organizational well-being.
Hmm.
And where the company was at that particular point, I think they had been started in, I would say, probably 2019. So shortly before COVID hit. And what happened within COVID was that there was this huge amount of venture capital funding into the digital mental health
Right.
space. And so, what Modern Health was experiencing was this influx of funds that they were like, well, we were able to do all of these amazing things with the additional funding that we have. And so, what they did was expand rapidly in terms of their employee population. And what they found as a result was that kind of getting strategically
Hmm.
prioritized
Hmm.
became a harder and harder challenge because you've got people with a ton of different skill sets and a ton of different ideas
Hmm.
about where to take the direction. And so I spent a lot of time talking with leaders there about, how do you get more aligned as an organization, and how do we upskill our managers to be able to navigate that kind of rapid growth,
Hmm.
and bring in new teams that are suddenly filled with a bunch of new people, and how do you kind of think about leading in that kind of an environment.
Yeah.
So that was some of the work that I did there, which was really interesting.
That's really interesting because when you have an organization, a startup that goes through rapid growth like that, there's so many pitfalls that you have to be careful of, right? Especially as you mentioned, upskilling the managers to being able to manage a few people to a lot of people. That management is hard enough, and then managing a lot of people who are all excited and want to go their own way can be very challenging. So I can imagine that the very stressful environment to be in.
Absolutely. And a lot of folks who may be first time
Hmm.
managers at that. got people transitioning right out of college and excited about tech, and they're excited about mental health, and they're excited about DEI work. And so you get people with a lot of enthusiasm to grow something and grow something super quickly, but they may just not have had exposure to
Yeah.
industry in the long term to really kind of know what does it look like to do this work, but also then incorporate all of the people leadership components that go along with that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. We've had this come up a lot. How you have new leaders, especially who really don't have any leadership training or experience, and so it's very hard for them to figure out what is my role as a leader, what is my role as someone who is responsible for a group of people, when they don't even
Mhm.
really understand that they've got to lead them and manage themselves, lead and manage the team and the group of people, and also be part of a leader for the organization as a whole. So I can imagine that being very challenging in that sort of environment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm wondering. So you also mentioned that you do coaching. What kind of
Mhm.
coaching do you do in that environment for something like this?
Yeah, so primarily I focus my work on executive coaching, and it's usually for mid-level managers or above.
Hmm.
Sometimes I'll coach folks in, senior positions or the C-suite. And a lot of that focus is really about finding leadership identity,
Hmm.
but also how to effectively manage the particular people that they have reporting into them. I mean, we know that everybody has entirely different lived experiences. They're different people. We know a little bit about, sort of consistent ways that people tend to show
Yeah.
up in the work environment or in the world. But what I really like to do is help leaders develop more flexibility in how they're working with their teams day to day. If I'm a very direct and not conflict avoidant
Hmm.
leader, that style is going to land very differently on an employee who tends to be more conflict avoidant or tends to prioritize harmony over really direct communication,
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
example. So I'll work with those folks in, this is just one example. Those kinds of folks I'll help, how do you soften your
Yeah.
approach to land more effectively in a way that that employee will really be able to hear? And what are the dynamics that they might be experiencing when you're showing up in this way? How might that be influencing their day-to-day work environment?
Yeah.
And how can you adapt your style to it? So just one example, but yeah.
I find that really interesting because what you're saying there in terms of helping leaders identify the leadership identity, right? I think that speaks to a lot of self awareness. So building that
Yeah.
self awareness, and then what you're talking about in terms of the flexibility really speaks to that that self management, right? Being able to understand how you are and then manage some of your tendencies to make it appropriate for the group or the audience that you're working with. How do you do that from an evidence based approach? How do you help them to build that self awareness and then to engage in self management?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, and I should go back to the psychodynamic conversation we were just
Hmm.
having, because I mean, when I start work with a new coaching client, what I really like doing at the outset is understanding, how did you get to where you are right now in your career,
Hmm.
and what factors might have informed how you who you are right now and how you got to be that way.
So
Which
psychosocial
then
history is
I
really important to understand.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Because with all of that additional context, then you can sort of help somebody figure out, if you are showing up in X way now, what might be some effective tools to adjust where you're going in the future? So even, even approaches like cognitive behavioral
yeah,
therapy, helping somebody understand, like when I'm in a meeting and I'm finding it really hard to, just sort of give other people space and not be the first voice in a
hmm,
conversation. How do you help them build that awareness and then build a little bit of reaction time between, the experience that they're having and maybe the response to whatever's
yeah.
happening internally? So that's just one way that I kind of think about bridging the gaps. But I find that, to your point, that self awareness piece is much easier to kind of grow and develop with all of that social history and the context behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially building in that little buffer of time, right? To
Yeah.
give you the
Yeah.
opportunity to just take a breath and not go with your immediate reaction, but really assess your emotional response and make sure it's appropriate, and then sometimes make that adjustment as necessary.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not cognitive behavioral treatment
Hmm.
per se, to address a mental health concern, but it's incorporating some of those tools and techniques to apply in a different kind of context,
Yes.
which I think is really interesting. And that's why, having a strong clinical skill set, I found to be just really, I mean, I use those skills every
Yeah.
day in the work that I do.
This is what I think is so interesting about being a psychologist and having those skills, because a lot of the theories and the things that we use to help treat serious mental health and serious mental health issues can also be applied at a different scale, right, to everyday behavioral problems that we have, right? I think it's just
Absolutely.
scaling and identifying how can you use it in an appropriate way so that you're not providing
Mhm.
clinical therapy, but you're also helping to use those tools and skills in the business world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point around the ethics of applying those kinds of tools and really knowing, as I was transitioning out of clinical work and into coaching work, I really had to spend a lot of time, thinking about what is
Hmm.
therapy, what is coaching, what is consultation, where's the overlap between them
Yeah.
and what makes them distinct. So, from an ethical standpoint, if I am providing coaching to someone versus therapy, I will stay out, for example, of diagnostic assessment.
Hmm.
And, it's helpful to have that framework so that I know when to refer a coach or a coaching client elsewhere.
Hmm.
But I try to really keep those realms to some degree separate while also acknowledging that we do have this very cool overlap space where we can pull from some of those tools and
Yeah.
techniques from the clinical world.
Right. It can be inform your thinking, right? But you don't
Yeah,
necessarily have to
yeah,
delve into there. Yeah. I think that's
exactly. Yeah,
that's a really cool approach, and I appreciate that you were actually able to sit down and think it through and be very explicit and conscious around what the steps and the actions that you're taking, really trying to separate them out and understand the overlap. Uh,
there's probably more overlap, but I tend to be a little bit more structured in my
yeah,
thinking, so
yeah.
I would imagine others sort of approach it differently. But having that sort of, yeah, those boundaries and compartmentalizations just for myself, especially at this phase of my professional
Yeah.
growth, has been really,
And I think that
really
can also be
helpful.
helpful. I mean, if you have that somewhat formed in your mind, it can be helpful for the client as well, especially if they're a
Yeah,
client that might need a little bit, some clinical services. Then you can be very clear on, hey, what we're doing is this and not that, and I'm going to refer you for that. So I think that makes sense.
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit more about some of the fun stuff that you do, because I know that you also work in entertainment. So I would love to hear some of the stories about some of the work that you've done in the entertainment industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have worked, I mean, through my life, I've been involved in entertainment to some degree or another, starting my career in theater. So I've worked with a lot of performance professionals,
Hmm.
and really it's around, things like performance anxiety. How do you speak in front of large audiences?
Hmm.
How do you use some of those performance skills in different kinds of settings? And how do you perform in a way that will keep you as focused as possible? So the majority of my entertainment industry work has been with individual coaching clients who are either transitioning out of entertainment and into industry or into a different line of work,
Hmm.
or who are trying to be better performers in the work that they do. So some of that has been in sports
Hmm.
work as well, folks who are yeah, like skiers, for examples, or people on teams doing soccer or playing soccer, just helping them sort of figure out how do you get into that mindset more effectively to perform at your best.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of describing it, especially even in performance theater, right? How do you get into that mindset to perform at your best? And I know there's a
Yeah.
lot of people, even not entertainers, but just in general, that have that performance anxiety, especially in front of public speaking. How do you coach them through that? How do you help them get through that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it again is sort of this idea of applying tools and techniques from the clinical
Hmm.
world and helping them think about what do you need? What do you what happens to you first of all in those settings that's contributing to the anxiety and contributing to, whatever it is that's happening in your head? How are you understanding that? And then what might be some other ways of approaching that? So, for example, somebody who finds themselves getting tongue tied when they're in front of a large
Yeah.
audience, for example, where they find themselves kind of losing their train of thought or they're forgetting their lines, for example, helping them sort of envision what is happening in that space. And I'm closing my eyes because I'm also thinking about my experience with it. But what is going on in that moment when I lose that line,
Hmm.
or when I lose that next train of thought for what I would like to say, what are the points that I'd like to make, for example. What's happening there that's an issue, and then how might I think about that slightly differently, or how might I, the common example is like imagining the audience naked and taking down the stress level,
Yeah.
which doesn't generally work. But how do I relate to both the material but also the audience in a different way that I can stay present in myself and
Hmm.
engaged? So that might also be mindfulness techniques, or accepting that no performance is ever going to be perfect, but giving yourself a primary source of focus can help you stay really grounded as you're trying to navigate all of that anxiety that
Yeah.
comes up with it. So yeah, just, I guess, one way of thinking about it.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful, and I love that you're able to help people, get grounded, to help them through this. I think that's a really great tool to help people through a lot of things. Actually, just being grounded.
Mhm.
Anna, we
Yeah.
could talk on and on, but I want to be respectful of your time. So how do people get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of you to talk more, or use your services? What's a good way to reach you?
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome to reach out to me directly by email. It's Anna, ANNA, at gibsondynamics.com, or you can reach out to the website at www.gibsondynamics.com. LinkedIn presence, feel free to check me out. But yeah, I would love to chat with anyone who's interested in talking about this stuff more. I love talking about it. So
Awesome.
thank you so much for having me,
Yeah,
Ernest. I
of
really
course. And
appreciate
before
it.
we let you go, I always want to take advantage of the experts we have on the show and say, what's some free advice, or what suggestions or recommendations do you have for people out there, especially in this day and age that we're all in right now?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm thinking back to the startup conversation we just had, and one thing that I really encourage all leaders to think about are, it is so much less costly to get the right people in the door
Mm,
at the outset
hmm.
and focus your energies and your resources on developing them than bringing someone in the door who isn't the right fit in the first place and having to go through an immensely, costly and time intensive process to, hire someone new in and then develop them. So, especially for startups in
Yeah,
particular, getting folks who are able to make the transition across that tipping point in the door right from the outset, I just think is so important.
yeah.
So thinking about hiring upfront would be my tip, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip, right? Thinking about the personnel that you're bringing in the door, and thinking about not just what the current environment, but the future environment, making sure those people can make the adjustment with you as the organization adapts and changes. I think that's really
Yeah.
great advice. Anna, thank you so much
Thanks.
for coming on the show. You're doing such great work talking about human behavior, especially evidence based principles of human behavior, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing out there. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope you'll join us next time.